Before I start, I need to make two caveats. The first caveat is that my theological understandings, my faith understandings are informed by the fact that I grew up in a Buddhist and a Catholic household. So I'm not Anglican of any kind. However, I just want to, I have been speaking with very close Anglican friends of mine, so I just want to say thank you to the Reverend Helen Lewis and the Reverend Luke Lana, who looked at the book and said, if you're giving the talk at St. Paul's, focus on this chapter. So if you have any critiques, you can email them. The other thing I also need to say is I work for Christian Aid, but I'm not speaking here today, obviously, with my Christian Aid hat on, so please don't email Patrick Watt. So what I'm going to talk about today is how liberation theology thinks with the ecological crisis and what it asks of us as communities of faith, and sort of the major message being, how do we become pilgrim churches in response to the poly-crisis that we are facing. So, to start, Jesus Christ only celebrated the Eucharist once. 48 hours later, he was killed by empire, that is, by the Roman oppressors, and the unjust social structures he was seeking to liberate his people from. This, for many liberation theologians, is what the Eucharist is all about. It is more than sign and symbol, and it suggests that our understanding of salvation and liberation are more than only individual and spiritual concepts. Liberation theology of the 1970s. So for those of you who don't know, Gutierrez's book appears on the scene is translated into English and appears on the scene in 1971, The Theology of Liberation. This movement is particularly quite intense in the 1970s and through the 80s, and it was intent on turning church communities into active agents of change, so as to change power relations in the name of social justice. James Common, a Black liberation theologian, for example, tells us that his point of analysis is that he sees the divine in what is disclosed in the historical struggle of the oppressed, to be other than what is intended by oppressive rulers. So many liberation theologians ask us to reflect on what we see when we gaze upon and are transformed by the encounter with the broken, battered, abandoned, assassinated body of Christ. And we can argue the creation that is groaning is this broken body. As I said, liberation theology we see particularly has its origins in Latin America, but it is also taken up very seriously in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in marginalized communities in Euro-America. Within their own communities of faith, liberation theologians speak of a call to deconstruct the oppressive nature of the monolith of religious dogma, very aware I'm in a crypt in a mistitial church now, by calling attention to the plight of the oppressed and to systemic injustice. Within this, they are also part of the 1970s, which is a febrile time, politically, morally, and a lot of these theologies join their consciousness to and are parts of movements that are projects of decolonization and anti-imperialism. So these theologies of liberation are trying to understand what it is to be people of faith in a way that breaks free of dogma, of institution, of colonial logics. So there is a lot of questioning and critiquing of structures of power, dominant systems, in order to suggest social transformations that recognize and validate the perspectives and struggles of marginalized peoples, cultures, and identities, and a recognition of the multiplicity of voices and the reciprocal exchange we can have in dialogue, right? What liberation theologians also very explicitly understand and talk about is that the enemy of God is mammon, that is capital, the lust for power and profit. Christ's divinity is important, but what's fundamental, what's crucial, is that he was an itinerant, he's the word made flesh, he's an itinerant poor monk, going from village to village, mobilizing for change. So, what happens when liberation theologies start to think about the ecological crisis? And I should say, and this is one of the things in my book, is that theologians, communities in the Global South, faith communities in the Global South, and leadership in the Global South, faith leadership, have been talking about the ecological crisis for decades now. So this is not sort of like a new conversation, but it goes back many years, at least 40, 50 years. Liberation theology understands this association of what's happening to marginalized communities alongside the devastation of land, especially thinking about what's happened to indigenous communities, as well as the recognition of the link between enforced poverty and the struggle for land rights. Understanding that the cry of the poor must be understood alongside the cry of the earth. And one of the places where you can see it really well articulated is in a 1995 book by Leonardo Boff. Boff draws together the strings of liberation theology with indigenous thinking and commentary on ecological justice, and focuses us in this way and reminds us to pay attention to what he calls two bleeding wounds. He argues that the first wound is one of poverty, which breaks the social fabric. The other wound is the systemic assault on the earth, which breaks down the balance of the planet, which he argues is under threat from the plundering of development as practiced by contemporary global societies. He connects the reflection on these wounds to the cry of the poor for life and freedom and beauty, and of the earth crying out against oppression. For Boff, the poor seek liberation as organized historical agents, while the earth seeks freedom through a new alliance with human beings. He further argues that liberation theology meets the ecological question when it reflects on the scale of the human tragedies caused by the climate crisis. Boff sees liberation theology as a place to do this because of that inherent critique of profit, of growth, of capital. And what he essentially says is that liberation theology denounces economic developmentalism and unfettered growth. And that's the major critique we have to make in order to combat the ecological crisis. As such, this liberational concern is rooted in the process of human action or labor that then transforms not only the systems in which we live in, but also how we think our moral kind of ideas. Poverty, therefore, is an environmental dilemma. For Boff, the great crisis is catalyzed by what he calls a culture of the satisfied. That is, those elites who benefit from the current economic system, as well as the desperate attempts of the poor to survive. He calls it a logic of sinfulness. As Catholic, we're going to talk about sin. He says this logic drives dominant populations to oppress the marginalized and plunder the earth. And this logic refuses cosmology. It refuses the strong interconnection that binds the ecological, the human, the social, and the spiritual aspects of life. And he sees this as a kind of spiritual malaise that's caused by the lust for profit and power. He also warns, and this is something that also contemporary political geographers are writing about and arguing for, that exclusively technical solutions are not enough because they don't stop the ways in which we're living, the ways in which we're thinking. It's just sort of a technical solution to something. And he and other liberation theologians argue that what we require is conversion, here understood as a movement away from seeing logic in a ruling system based on profit and social manipulation. And to address this, we need something more than social justice. And for those of you who have read Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical of 2015, which seems a while ago, you can see that strong link between that encyclical and Boff's thinking in 1995. Boff and also Pope Francis sees the building of a new alliance between humankind and other sentient beings, a kind of cosmic community, and argues that our theologies and our communities of faith must adopt a cosmology of ecological discourse we make a moral choice, a conversion, to move away collectively from unfettered profit and growth to building what he calls a logic of the common good. Yvonne Guevara from Brazil, is a Brazilian eco-feminist, also takes this up, and she works from the reflecting on the lived experience of female communities. And she also sees poverty as part of the ecological crisis and asks us to pay attention to those who she says are the victims of unfettered growth. For Guevara, these are indigenous peoples, women, rainforests, and natural biodiversity. She decries arguments within feminist spaces that worry, oh gosh, if we talk about the ecology, are we going to stop talking about women? Says that while we're attempting to settle these disagreements, the world is struggling against deforestation, pollution, and starvation that is brought on by the profit-making system. So in this way, Guevara's argument is mirroring both. And she argues very strongly that there's a need to go beyond competition in order to make another world possible, and that the solution cannot come from what she calls a patriarchal system of dependence, because it reproduces violence, and such violence is suffered by the earth as well as the marginalized. Once again, we see here the need to move collectively towards a common good. And Guevara, parallelly, also asks for a new national and international order that brings together civil society to structure a qualitatively new daily life. And here, faith communities are very much understood as being part of that civil society. Going back to James Cone, I love James Cone. James Cone's writing on liberational thinking and the ecological crisis is also very concerned with our moral stance. He has this extremely beautiful essay, which if you haven't read it, I urge you to read it. It's called Whose Earth Is It Anyway? And he writes simply but beautifully of the necessary relationship between faith and action. And he says that our Christian faith tells us that God created us all for freedom. And this means we must engage in action, as well as social theory, which we use to analyze social structures that are unjust. And this analysis, this very material-rooted contextual analysis, helps us to realize what must be done to realize the freedom to which all are entitled. Cone notes that our faith is not only our love for God, but a love for God that is expressed through love for our neighbor. It's the kenosis that's spilling out of love. This love demands justice. I love that. Love demands justice. As the act of loving, as the divine has called us to, requires more than a pious feeling, but demands social and political analysis so that we escape the trap of substituting piety for justice. In the essay I was talking about, he makes very explicit the link between the struggle for racial justice in North America and the struggle for ecological justice. Particularly, he makes the connection between racism and the degradation of the earth as much needed work. And here he quotes from the work of womanist theologians like Emily Towns, Dolores Williams, and Karen Baker Fletcher, who were already making connection between the parallel definement of land and bodies of color, especially female bodies of color. What Cone argues is that the same logic and reasoning that structured slavery and segregation is also the logic that destroys and strips away the earth. Some communities are disposable, the land is disposable, the air is disposable, the sea is disposable, and it is for profit. That's what that logic is. For Cone, struggles for ecological justice that do not also fight racism are problematic. And those that don't include ecological and anti-racist fights that don't include ecological justice in their work are also problematic. These must be interlinked struggles. Cone, much like Pope Francis does later than Cone in Laudato Si, also uses strong images of sin and evil to make these connections. And he says, and this is I'll paraphrase the quote, that racism is profoundly interrelated with other evils, including the degradation of the earth. and these evils must be encountered and overcome together. So here, our conversion to fighting for ecological justice is interlinked to the work to overturn all injustices. We see this also in Asian theology. The Indian Jesuit Samuel Ryan argues something similar, and he focuses on the question of right relationship and cosmology. Ryan makes a very deliberate shift away from what we call theological anthropology. One thing I really enjoyed in his work is he provides an anecdote of how the Fijian islanders were really taken aback by the first Christian missionaries, not only because of the layers of clothing they wore in a hot climate, but because the religion they preached had little to do with the land or the sea. And so they kept asking, what kind of God is this that was not interested in land or sea or the river? Ryan goes on to argue that the divine that dwells in the heart of reality is the central message of all cosmic religions. And this is something Asian theologians do very significantly, is drawing from other cosmologies. He talks about the Upanishads and the Psalms, and reminds us that the whole universe is pervaded by the divine. And turning away from this understanding for Ryan is sinful, so there's that word sin again. And he argues that an anthropocentric, that is focusing on the human, insulates us from being rooted in the cosmos, right? So Ryan asserts the need to understand that creation is part of the spirit of the divine, brooding over the waters that turned chaos into the cosmos. He foregrounds, as I said, the contemplative traditions of Asia in order to make this argument. But this only doesn't happen in Asian theology. Celia Dean Drummond, who's just a few years away in Oxford, takes this idea of cosmology and turns it into her understanding of deep incarnation. Both Ryan and Dean Drummond discuss, for example, John 3:16, 2 Corinthians 5:19, Romans 8:21, and Ephesians 1:10, to highlight the fact that the story of salvation is told through Christ in the memory of creation, wherein all of the heavens are evidence God gives of themselves. All must be seen in the context of an ongoing, dynamic creation, right? So in all of these religious discourses, creation reveals the divine, and so it is there to be contemplated and to be seen as part of creative activity. And turning away from this is sinful. Aruna Nyaladasan, who is a feminist liberation theologian, reminds us that we also need to center the Earth's struggle for integrity. Thinking through a feminine paradigm for the ecology, she describes this by noting how women in South Asia frequently understand the link between the suffering of the earth and the violence that women endure. So it's interesting to see womanist theologians in North America also making that same link as well. She says, again, the connectedness of cosmology that sees person and nature as having this kind of duality in the unity with the divine. And so for Jnanadasan, in fact, taking up this struggle is how we resist death. Taking up the ecological struggle in this interconnected way is how we resist death. Like I said, the idea of seeing environmental violence and violence of women as interlinked is something that we see extremely well expressed in the work of womanist theologians. And I just want to mention very quickly here Dolores Williams's work, Sin, Nature, and Black Women's Bodies. She decries the logic of domination, insisting we must work for planetary freedom as well as bodily freedom for women. She says it's just as sinful to defile and rape the body of the black woman, so too it is sinful to defile and rape the body of the earth. Similarly, she extends this understanding with also working with, she extends this understanding as well to say that if we want to understand that the earth is the Lord's, it requires a radical critique of property rights, an abolishing of slavery, and also opposing capitalistic systems that privatize the land, the sea, the rivers, and even drinking water. We must ensure that environmental protection is not divorced from people's survival rights. And this requires intense struggle, and it requires a revolutionary kairos, right? In that sense, the conversion is also a conversion to struggle, if that is clear. I've talked about land and sea and rivers a lot, and I just want to very, very quickly talk about the importance of listening to indigenous liberation and indigenous liberation theologians. Quite often, indigenous voices are silenced in considerations for global justice because frameworks for justice often only seek an understanding of justice ideas that make sense or are easily actionable. Continually at the COP meetings, indigenous actors are frequently left out of the conversations. And in fact, at the most recent COP, even my colleagues at Christian Aid were talking about how increasingly even civil society actors are being left out of these conversations. This is really, really problematic, that the loudest voices in the room are the lobbyists and the fossil fuel activists and the governments. And it is because of this silencing that indigenous scholars talk about the importance of refusal. Watene, for example, argues that indigenous people are often silent in justice theorizing and denied an active role in the policy landscape, even though they are globally present and have been present for so many years. Throughout the world, it is the tribal and indigenous peoples who have been significantly marginalized and oppressed, whether it's the First Nation communities of Canada or the Vedas, the forest dwellers of Sri Lanka. Several indigenous communities that were Christianized also expressed their theology from the space of suffering and oppression. And this is a theology that attempts to express the Christian faith from the point of view of these experiences. It's a resistance theology, spoken or written by those who have become environmental prisoners on their own land. This is something that Wati Longchang writes about in quite depth as well. As the Supreme Being is conceived in terms of creation, the issue of space is a central justice issue, and these struggles of resistance are about saying not only about land back, but about creation back in a very significant kind of way. And so within this, the major source of indigenous theology is the concrete action taken to care for and defend the life present in the trees, in the forest, in the water, in the land, and also in people. Right? I'm conscious of time, so I'll move ahead a little bit. If we call back to the story of the Fijian islanders that Ryan narrated, we will remember how the islanders could not fathom a God who had no connection to the land, as the land is what provided life. So why was this God separated from life? Right? So this kind of theology as resistance would address immediately the anger of the disenfranchised and also the emptiness of industrialized societies that are so abstracted from the land, that is, they are abstracted from the land and from struggle. What does this mean for our theological imaginary? I think, thinking with this centrality of land and sea and water and air, indigenous theologians ask us to focus on collective solidarity and resistance for the defense of the oppressed, and here, of course, all of creation, including humanity, is the oppressed. Through collective resistance, indigenous theologians would seek, according to Longchar, to promote values and structure that enhance life and liberate from what liberation theologians see as bondage. To do this requires moral commitment and material analysis. In 2023, which was only last year, feels like a long time ago, Pope Francis writes Laudato Deum. Laudato Deum is a kind of a follow-up to Laudato Si, and he argues that this collective future cannot happen without a powerfully reconfigured global politics. And here he moves us away from centering the nation state, right, or governments. And he says we cannot focus on keeping power to a select few, but we have to think and act more cooperatively. Underlining this commitment to liberation and celebrating the power of collective action, Francis suggests that we start to reflect on how we can be guided by the social movements and complex narratives that arise from below. The history of Christianity is filled with countless examples of committed individuals who prophetically spoke out against injustice and selflessly worked to create a more equitable society. no longer really, within their prophetic thoughts, they're no longer understanding the church in this one geographic sense or one parish community, but they talk about a people of God throughout the world. Liberation theologians in particular try to shift from being a primarily hierarchical understanding of church to one that also emphasized the pilgrim character of the journey of the people of God in this world. This understanding of the people of God as an opportunity for the involvement of the entire community of God's people. So what is really required is a turn to organizing that's not rooted in a particular identity, but is connected to the understanding of shared historical trajectories that we all face because of the enduring nature of the imperial center, or the lust for profit and growth. In short, and to use an oft-repeated quote, it requires the building of the infrastructure of dissent and solidarity. And this is a key part of the conversion that communities of faith are called to. To paraphrase Ella Baker, it means facing a system that does not suit you and devising the means by which to change it. What do we, as communities of faith, need to do in order to build a global infrastructure that dissents from man on? This is the question that I would ask you to reflect on. Maybe also today it's nice and sunny outside, so on a rain day. How to do this? If I were trying to think this through myself, I would say in part it requires looking again at the practical actions and the analytical work of liberational voices that are geared towards freeing the community or the subject from a something. As an example, so liberation theologians in Latin America look at the present time in which they were writing, and they say, well, the work we have to do is to liberate Latin America from capitalism. And James Cone would write about the importance of liberating Black Americans from racial discrimination. Restrepo, again another Latin American theologian, who analyzes what neoliberalism has done and how it has bent and distorted life. And so if I were to look at this present time of polycrisis, to use another big buzzword, I would say there's a need to liberate society from a host of imperialisms, which we can list as militarization, nationalism, authoritarian liberalism, ecocide, neocolonialism, and the continuing logic of capital that runs through all of these. And of the list of violences I've mentioned, perhaps the most urgent, with wars in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, are not only the human lives lost, which we grieve so much, but the cost to all sentient beings. As such, the ecocide, for example, being created by militarized landscapes. Military activities cause severe damage to the natural environment, especially through the increasing use of chemical weaponry. Additionally, the indiscriminate use of such weaponry is always in places where some humans or some sentient beings are seen as lesser. And here the environment is part of that lesser category. It means that precious little is done to protect wildlife and natural environments during times of increased militarization. These are structural violences that continue the same logics of imperialism and coloniality that trouble the theologians I have mentioned throughout my talk. And we should be provoked to action. We should be looking around and doing that analysis and be provoked to action. Shifting these forces requires a dynamic struggle that can and will pour out of social movements, and churches, as people of God, as communities of faith, I would argue, need to be more like social movements. The journey to a liberated earth can only happen if there is a moral awakening. More importantly, it must start in transformation and conversion to a collective struggle for liberation that works towards a cosmic and planetary community, and which reclaims the narrative from encroachers and manipulators. What all these voices point us to is the fact that we are in a breakdown of rightful relationship. The ecological crisis is the rupture of the communion amongst creatures and creation. Theological voices from the global south, from indigenous communities, from liberational spaces have been telling us this for many years via their critiques of whiteness, capitalism, colonialism, and other dominating structures. These critiques speak in love and hope and anger, but they're not provided to us in a passive way, but in aching, in agony. They demand an awakening. They demand communities of faith that are in movement, that are pilgrims. Thank you. Thank you. That's a really a very good question. And really, once more, I would just want to say my Christian Aid hat is completely off when I answer this question. I'll talk about the UN because I've worked in international development for most of my life, and I'm not necessarily someone trained in human rights or law, so I can't speak to the intimacies of that kind of a system. When we, once again, we look at the United Nations and there are many people in the United Nations and the UN agencies who do amazing work, and I never want to detract from that. There are people who put their lives literally on the line, like we've seen in Gaza recently. Their lives are on the line for the work that they do. But when we look into the superstructure of something like the United Nations, the problem we run into is that the ways in which, for example, the voting system is set up is such that the most powerful bloc of votes, or the most powerful things that can happen are vested in the countries that are seen as economically and militarily the most wealthy. So there's a great sense of, there's a lack of a redistribution of power within the UN system, and that's quite problematic. The other block that something that the UN faces is that the UN has no choice but to work with governments even when the government becomes a bloc. I'll give you an example. I'm Sri Lankan, and in 2009, April, 2009, there was several bombings in some Catholic churches and one evangelical church and a few hotels. And the bombs in this instant were identified as from the Muslim community. And one of the underreported aspects of what happened is that a group of refugees who were in Sri Lanka from the Ahmadiyya community, who are a Muslim community, were immediately chased out of the lodgings they had been put into. And they were being kind of basically subject to a lot of mob violence. And they had to run away, and they were hidden some in police stations, some in like courtyards of bungalows and things like that. And a group of us who were an interfaith coalition that worked with refugees, who were trying to help them and work with them. And the UNHCR ended up being quite powerless because they could not get the government to agree to look after these people, because would not be popular for the government to be like, oh yeah, we'll look after some Muslims right now. And it literally came down to a handful of 10 to 15 individuals to look after these people. And so that's where the UN systems become problematic. There's kind of a joke, there's kind of a bit of a joke in civil society where the first helicopters to leave will be the UN, but that's because of issues of policy and procedure that mean that UN foreign staff will always be evacuated, and then the local staff are left to die quite often. So we do have to look at the UN in terms of it as a monolith and ask the questions of what does it do to protect life, because it is so entangled with the nation state. And this is why Pope Francis, for example, and not just Pope Francis, I think lots of people who are looking at this issue would say that we need to redistribute power and we need to have more kind of collective, cooperative engagements in place. The other thing that's really worrying, I think, and you're right, corporations figured out that social justice sells. It's all about Instagram, right? Everyone's got it going. But we are also seeing a significant issue, particularly in the humanitarian and development world, where in the past 15 years or so, governments have become increasingly autocratic and repressive. For example, in some of the African countries that we work in, Christian works in, for example, you cannot do the work you want to do unless you register with the government. And if the government doesn't like what you're doing, they won't let you register. Or if you do something that they don't like, particularly in Asia, you'll be subject to what's called a tax audit. So local community-based organizations, what you call a CSO or CBO, are unable to do their work. Human rights defenders are hounded, they're surveilled, they're killed. You look in Latin America, over and over again, we hear of particularly queer, feminist, ecological justice activists being killed because of the work that they do, and they are not protected by the state. And what a lot of governments do is that they've found that corporations really like to do social justice work and also give money to governments. So increasingly, for example, in India, the private sector is taking over the space of traditional civil society. This is problematic. It breaks down the ability to organize. It detracts away from communities at the root, and it turns, and once again, we are kind of oriented towards capital. And this is not only just secular CSOs, faith communities also struggle with this in particular, right? When that encroachment happens. And so once again, we have to consider how do we rethink the ways in which we organize and assemble and ask, and who really is holding governments to account, especially when the UN system has this entitlement. So it is a question for the UN, I think, and in a space of moral reflection, which I wonder is whether that's happening at this moment, considering the crisis in the DRC and in Gaza especially. I hope that answered the question, I think. Thank you. I wish I had a very good answer for that, because it's the thing I'm thinking about all the time. And I know that also other communities, particularly faith communities, are thinking about that all the time. For example, and trying to do it. It is a difficult thing because we live in this extremely strange and polarized world, in a culture, in a set of culture wars. I myself had to really deal with that a lot. One, because, for example, in some spaces that I am, and I talk about my faith, people walk away saying, well, can you have faith and be really committed to our social justice organizing? And so I think one of the first things there is I think for better cooperation across faith and secular community service organizations to understand that communities of faith are not all, the stereotype of a faith church. So this requires, I think, a little bit of bravery and dialogue across, like some faith communities are unwilling to I think, cross-purpose as well. So it requires a little bit of bravery and dialogue at that level. We also need to, I think, hold our faith leaders to account on this and say, the thing we do want you to speak about more is how the Rwanda bill is absolutely heinous and performative cruelty. That is what we want, And I think we can do that. We can mobilize in our parish communities to do that. We can study, we can look back at, I think, once again, look at the 1970s and the 1980s in particular. There were so many faith communities who were part of the fight against apartheid in South Africa. The World Council of Churches in the 1970s wrote and organized so beautifully against the Vietnam War. And we have lost that sense. We have lost that. That doesn't happen anymore very much at the World Council of Churches. And so we need to ask that question, why? Why have we lost that moral courage? So there needs to be a little bit of internal reflection, but also outward action, right? So I think that's a question to ask. One of the things I do sometimes, because I'm quite annoying, is if my priest doesn't talk about social justice in his sermon, I go and ask him why. Probably why he doesn't like to see me coming. But you can do that. You can be a little bit annoying individually and of your own, because you see what's happening. And you're quite right. We don't have to look very far to see the Home Office posting videos on its social media of deporting someone to Rwanda, because they think that that's great and what a jolly. But the other thing is, look at our faith communities and really look at them in a grassroots kind of way. During the pandemic, faith communities became very strong because ideas of cooperation and mutual solidarity are baked in to our faith, baked into Christian faith, baked into Hindu faith, Buddhist faith, Islamic faith, Sikh faith, particularly the Gurudwaras were saving people. In Glasgow City, the Gurudwaras feed something like 2,000 people a day for free. A nice hot meal. Imagine that, right? For nothing at all. And it's just there. It's just what one of the ladies there was quite fantastic. And I asked her, I said, why do you do that? She's like, it's what we do. Faith communities need to do what we do and not be afraid of doing that. Sometimes we're scared to do that, but we just say, we already did it. The structures are there. The models are there, right? The early church was not in a nice big building with beautiful carvings. I mean, this is a beautiful building, don't get me wrong. It was a grassroots movement, a collective grassroots movement where they had a spokesperson that they chose, on a cyclical way. Can we rethink going back to that in some way? Can we consider how we can be that kind of movement again? It's already there. We just need to tease it out a bit more. I absolutely agree with you. Divestment is a very key and very important strategy, with pension funds as one good example, as well as ethical investments, which can be a bit difficult. With my political economist hat on, ethical investment is a bit problematic too once you start to follow the line. But this, and you're right, that is a key strategy. Part of the strategy also has to be public education, I think, right? Where is this pension fund invested in? Not everyone knows. And sometimes, for example, you go to work somewhere and they've already enrolled you in a pension fund, and then you look it up and you're like, oh my goodness, can I put my pension fund somewhere else? I do agree that that a strategy of ethical investment and of raising that conscious awareness is important. It's a very amongst a range of strategies that must be used. It is a key strategy, and in order for that to be effective and to be taken out more, also requires a lot of public education on these issues, because not every individual or community, even every faith community, is invested in that. Divestment is such an important thing for us to think about. And Sophie, may I raise the example that Sophie and I were just talking about as well? Ethical investments and ensuring that our pensions and that our business models are ethical and not only driven by profit is important. There's also larger institutional things we need to look at. I talked about militarization in my talk, and we need to think about divestment in a larger way. So if you look, for example, here's the example, Church House, which is a sort of a venue center here that I'm sure you've all gone to, has for several years been hosting an armaments conference, right? That's problematic, because that's the other way around, where profits from arms sales are being given to a church institution. That's a big flag to raise. Do we want churches to receive profits from arms manufacturers? That's a question to ask. So we have to, you're right, absolutely, have those ethical investments, have the strategy of pushing businesses to become more ethically aware, but not just more ethically aware, actually moving away from certain models of profit. Why do we have the destruction of life in the DRC right now? It's because of an ethical thing that's gone wrong. We are moving towards a more green economy. The green economy now, the technical solution for the green economy is to run on electric cars. Electric cars are powered by lithium. Lithium is found in mines. Those mines are in the Congo. And the war for lithium particularly means that in order to protect their investments, companies that some in Home are listed on the London Stock Exchange hire mercenaries to protect their investments, and governments are also involved in these warfares. Whose dead and dying. Innocent lives are lost in there. In Tanzania, this was about 10, 15 years ago, and I read about it in my book. In Tanzania, a young girl was just trying to cross from one end of a field to another, and the mercenary guarding the mine thought that she was trying to encroach on the mine, and he shot her and she died. Right? So if we think about the issue of lithium being this idea of we can have a better, greener economy, it's still causing bloodshed. So we have to ask that question. The answer would be, I think, we move away completely from a car-based economy. We need to think about, for example, 15-minute walkable cities, better insulated homes, things like that. That's a greener economy than an electric car. I don't know if that makes sense, but thank you.